Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Galactic Album Reviews and General Musical Meanderings. This week I want to talk to you guys a little bit about an album called Beat, the 1982 entry from King Crimson, the middle of their 80s trilogy. Or I might also be talking a little bit about the band Beat, which is a current tribute/reboot tour that's dedicated to covering these albums on kind of the eve of their 40th anniversary. Now, these albums are really important to me because whenever I discovered Rush and kind of figured out that the part of what I liked about their music was called progressive rock, I kind of went on a shopping spree and ended up getting a lot of Yes albums, a lot of Genesis albums, and I kind of ran aground. I wanted to know where to head next. Now, back in those days, you couldn't just, look something up on the internet. So in order to do research on these kind of things, you had to do it the old-fashioned way. I rode my bicycle to the library, and there was a book that was Encyclopedia of Rock, and I just went to the index and looked up progressive rock bands and just gave me a list, and I went through the book and checked it out. And King Crimson was one of the ones that stuck, so much so, as a matter of fact, after I discovered them in this book and started thinking about them, I remember having a dream about King Crimson and came up with this logo for them in this dream. They had an album cover, it was green. None of those things ever matched the actual King Crimson, but way before I ever kind of got into them, I had a fixation on what they were about. And both Discipline and Through Perfect Pair were extremely influential to me in high school. But it would be a few years before I got a hold of a copy of Beat. And I think Beat is really interesting in this regard because it took all the stuff that Discipline was doing and streamlined it a little bit. At the same time, pulling in more pop influences and maybe making a stronger play to get on the radio and possibly even MTV. There were a couple of videos associated with this, but King Crimson is very strict about their online presence, and I certainly don't want to go against the wishes of the group. So usually when I make one of these videos, I'm going to put audio examples in there. I can't do that this time around, but what I will do, which I don't normally do, is give you a little of a rundown of the entire album straight through, track by track. If you have any doubt about the connection between what happened with Discipline and what happens on Beat, it's cleared up at the outset of the very, very first song, Neal and Jack and Me. One of the things that defined the 1980s King Crimson was their use of this polymetric guitar interplay. Some people say kind of gamelan inspired. And the very first thing you hear on this track is one guitar player playing in 5/4, another one playing in 7/8, and listening to them go out of phase and back in. Of course, all the while, Adrian Belew is singing. The other thing that Neal and Jack and Me establishes on Beat that's actually different from Discipline is that it's probably the closest that King Crimson ever made to making a concept album. All the lyrics in this album are underpinned by an influence of Beat poets. So, for example, the Neal and Jack in this song is Neal Cassidy and Jack Kerouac, and the song is pulled on some of their experiences from the road. And like a lot of King Crimson music, it makes the best of dynamic contrast. It's alternatively explosive, and soft and mellow and subdued, and it's all put together again by Adrian Belew's amazing, amazing voice and Adrian Belew's songwriting. Adrian Belew is very strongly influenced by the Beatles as far as his song forms go. And you see that even more distinctly in the second track, Heartbeat. Heartbeat would reappear a little bit later on Adrian Belew's probably most visible solo album, Young Lions, when he was kind of associating really strongly with David Bowie. And that version really showed the kind of stripped down song version of this tune. Of course, this version is way more fripped up with a lot more nuances and side travels as you go through it. But the essence of the song is still there. It's really not super experimental as far as King Crimson music goes. As much as this is a tune that feels structured like a Beatles song, vocally it shows his connection with Roy Orbison as an influence on his own. And the other feature of Heartbeat that I think is also super important is Tony Levin's backup vocals, which is something that kind of always gets a little bit, overlooked, I think, because Tony Levin was one of those guys, not really a vocalist, but he had a good enough pitch and could match timbres enough to where he ended up being one of those guys that, as a backup singer, made the lead singer sound better. Now, if you want to talk about Tony Levin being featured on something, the next track, Sartori and Tangier, starts off with him on a classic Chapman stick line. And one that also uses one of Tony Levin's favorite effects is to have a very close in-time delay. So it sounds like what he's doing on one hand is way more complicated than it is. And another feature of King Crimson's that's held over from the previous album also arrived in this song, and that's the lack of hi-hat. Bill Bruford was specifically tasked by Robert Fripp to not use hi-hat while doing this King Crimson work. And you see him working very hard to avoid that by using rim clicks as a sort of a ride device. And I think that adds so much to the characteristic of the song. It's one of the things that really makes it super unique as far as the feel of the song goes. Bill Bruford's also featured very strongly in the next song, which is Waiting Man. Now, this is a live favorite, where Bill Bruford comes out and he has these sort of electric drums and he plays this pattern. In live situations, Adrian Belew comes out and plays a harmony pattern with him, and they match sticking. It's a very visually pleasing pleasing thing. Tony Levin also joins in the game with a very rhythmically textured thing, but it's all very subdued in the background. It's as complicated and interlocking and crazy as it is, it still feels like background to what will be another one of the kind of mellow songs that you'll see King Crimson do. But despite being kind of subdued, there are also, again, some very outlandish, insane things that happen in this, not the least of which is Adrian Blue's radical, just noise solo where he would turn around to the amplifier and just listen to the feedback and literally solo in feedback. And Adrian Blue's kind of maniacal side shows up on the next track even, flowing into this song, Neurotica. King Crimson, often after Adrian Blue was involved, kind of did these spoken word pieces. You saw it with Thelahun Jinjit, you saw it to a degree with Elephant Talk, and here you have another tune with lyrics that are inspired by beat poetry. Adrian Blue just ranting and almost insanely about the busyness and anxiety that goes along with city life. And the band rises to the occasion. That it's very chaotic and more chaotic even than some of the stuff you saw in Discipline. Because although there are definitely chaotic moments on Discipline, they still have the sense of being very strict and regimented. Neurotica, in comparison, feels so cacophonous that it masks the underlying structure, because there is a structure to it. And you can certainly see how the structure plays out by the way that Adrian Blue's vocals line up with the big hits and the larger passages in the piece. And again, as much of this piece is an insane assault almost on the listener, has this beautiful middle section that, again, is delicately put and serves as such a contrast, like an eye in the storm of the hurricane that is the chaos of this piece. And the sense of contrast that you see in this is something that they play with throughout the album in a bigger picture too, because after this piece is followed by one of the tenderest pieces on the album. After Adrian Blue came on in 1980, King Crimson always tended to include a song that was almost like a soothing ballad that I used to call the lullaby song, because I would use them sometimes to even sing to my children at night to go to sleep. Mate Kudasai, you saw this on Discipline. Even further on, you saw One Time on Thrak. These beautiful pieces, and to me, Two Hands is that piece on this album. It's such a severely underrated track because I love the vibe that it gives. You got Bill Bruford playing the log drums again, and a beautiful, sensitive guitar solo that just is gut-wrenching from Fripp. It sings out on top of this texture. And Adrian Blue, of course, is putting these rhythm lines behind them that are very melodic, and they don't interlock in the same way, but they add so much to the structure of the piece in their sparseness. And Blue's voice just soars out over the top of this texture in the most unimaginably beautiful way. Now, following up that super delicate piece with the howler, it feels almost abrupt, another big shift, because this is the one song to me on the album that feels a little bit less inspired than the others. Given that King Crimson is so great at playing with odd time signatures, they do it in such a deft and natural fashion that the 5/4 groove on this piece feels really kind of clunky and ham-fisted. And Adrian Blue's ability to kind of make things feel spontaneous in his vocals works against him a little bit on this piece, because it doesn't really settle into a strong melody. But as is with King Crimson, if you don't like something, just stick around for a second, because the bridge of this piece is a really cool, almost like instrumental excursion section, and the end of the piece goes out with another great vocal duet between Adrian Blue and Tony Levin. It's just amazing. A really great way to bring that one out to a conclusion. Now, concluding this album in a bigger picture, you have this piece, Requiem, and I think that this may be one of King Crimson's best studio improvisations. And I love the way that the title of this song frames it so well. Because, Requiem is supposed to be a song that's meant to give pause to a person who's recently passed. And there's a sense of rage with this. There is another almost chaotic element to it that's sort of the internal anger that a person would feel at having the loss of something that's important to them. But at the same time, Tony Levin's stand-up bass work is mournful. It's so you feel like it's crying there at the end. And that dichotomy of almost the do not go gentle to that good night sense is embedded in this improvisation. A lot of people who are hardcore progressive rock fans who are definitely still reeling from the change that King Crimson made in the 80s, a more drastic change than any of their other contemporaries, more drastic than Yes turning to 90125, more drastic than Rush's going to moving pictures. This is a really huge change from their angry, almost orchestral work to their sort of new wave period. And progressive rock fans who are still dealing with that, I think, really had a hard time watching King Crimson try to turn their experimental nature into something a little bit more streamlined, a little more pop, and a little more straightforward. But in doing so, I think you ignore all the experimentation that hangs underneath the surface of these songs. And I think that one of the most amazing things you can do in a piece of music is to bundle complexity within accessibility. And Beat is one of the places where they really started to do that very, very well. I think even more so than they did on Discipline. But there's a distinction to make there, because Discipline really saw the band capturing lightning in a bottle. Here they're trying to harness that energy. And in some ways it makes the album feel a little more sterile in comparison to its predecessor. But again, if you're able to look past that, this is a classic album. And it's one that's so classic, in fact, that 30, 40 years later, you've got Beat the Band. Adrian Belew and Tony Levin were trying to figure out some way to bring the King Crimson 80s stuff back to life at its 40-year anniversary. And this started actually right around whenever COVID hit. So right when they're starting to get the wheels to turn on this, they got shut down. Nobody was playing music for a year, 2 years. But the wheels had already started to turn, and they reached out to some people to try to cover it. Robert Fripp, he's done. He said pretty much no way, but if you believe in it, Adrian, I will support you. And they asked Bill Bruford, and Bill Bruford's response was like, what am I going to do, sit around in hotel rooms at this age? I'm not really interested. So Adrian Belew and Tony Levin quite smartly recruited Danny Carey of Tool as a drummer and Steve Vai as a guitar player, both top-notch, fantastic players. And in some ways, so radically different from the guys that preceded them on these songs, that the prospect of listening to them reinterpret these songs in a way that worked for them was a really, really compelling idea. Danny Carey has Bill Bruford level chops, but his background in hard rock and kind of progressive metal gives him a very deep-seated feel. And it reminded me of the time that I saw Tool on their 10,000 Days tour. During that performance, the crowd got so excited that it felt like there was an energy in the arena that was almost overwhelming. Like I felt like there was chaos was going to break loose. And that feeling that Danny Carey brought to the band is what I felt that night. Having that level of just depth and intensity brought a different dimension to their group. Bill Bruford's style of playing feels very top. It's very like this. You know, it's very chugga 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 chugga. Danny Carey's is down and it's deep and it drives it along and it makes everything feel really just like almost, extra dimensional. Now, Steve Vai is an interesting choice also for an entirely different set of reasons. Of course, Steve Vai, like Adrian Belew, got his start with Frank Zappa's band. Although they weren't in the band at the same time, Adrian Belew preceded him by a few years. He was in the 70s. Vai kind of was involved in the 80s. But you could probably count on one hand the number of guitar players that Frank Zappa brought on to actually play what he calls stunt guitar on the same sort of lead guitar stuff that he would normally cover. He had guitar players in the band, of course, but to have a guy that actually solos on guitar on the same footing as Frank Zappa is a big deal. So for both these guys to have had that background, to have shared that level of performance so early in their careers, and to be trained kind of by the same guy is a really, really fascinating dynamic. And they've never played together before, so that's another interesting dynamic. Also interesting is that Steve Vai is a very, very different player than Robert Fripp. Robert Fripp has the definition of reserved. He plays kind of in the dark, sitting down and, head down. Steve Vai played with David Lee Roth at one point. That's not to denigrate his chops, but he's a flashy player. So plugging them into this mix really changes the dynamic. Now, Beat from the outset said that they were not interested in playing those songs note for note, but instead reinterpreting it with the members of the band. And I think that if you watch that show and you're a fan of King Crimson, you won't be disappointed in the way that they did that. So great, in fact, that some members of the band's fan base are positing that perhaps even these performances are better than King Crimson. This guy Anthony Carone over on at Make Weird Music proposed this idea. Now, when I saw them, I thought it was a great show, and I loved every moment of it. It was unbelievable musicianship and very fascinating. But as great as it was not the transcendental experience that I've had when I've seen King Crimson before. When I've seen King Crimson before, they've taken me places. I've literally lost time at King Crimson shows because I was so embedded in the music. That didn't happen at Beat. And so that brings me to the second proposition of Anthony Carone, which is Beat is King Crimson, which is a very interesting prospect if you look back on all of my posts that I've recently done in the past decade about Yes and their identity, and about how the current version of Yes is actually a legitimate version of Yes, even though it doesn't have any original players. One would think that I would say the same thing about Beat and King Crimson. However, I don't feel that way about this. If I can say the current version of Yes is Yes, and Beat is not King Crimson, or can't really call themselves King Crimson, it seems like I'm being contradictory there. But I think there's a couple of really important differences. Okay, on the one side, you could say that Chris Squire passed on. He was the one member that had always been there in Yes, just like Robert Fripp has always been the guy that was in King Crimson. So with his passing, theoretically speaking, under this same idea, Yes was gone. There was no more Yes. However, Yes was a band that had not just one classic lineup, but two defining lineups for the band. And both of those fought for their own authenticity. And King Crimson is another group that has had so many lineups and has defined themselves so many different ways. They've been defined by change as much as, if not more than Yes, because the music changed so radically with each lineup change. And if Robert Fripp has given Beat their blessing, how's that different from Chris Squire giving Billy Sherwood the blessing to be the bass player for Yes? And why is that okay? Well, here's my train of thought on this. As much as Chris Squire was the musical director essentially for Yes for so long and steered the direction of the band, he did not have a very specific philosophy that he brought to bear on the band. He would bring members in and they would kind of collaborate and make songs that were part of the Yes tradition. King Crimson, on the other hand, was guided as much by Robert Fripp as a person, but his philosophy and his concepts about how music works is what always drove King Crimson forward. And in my mind is one of the ways in which those transcendental peak experiences that I had every time I ever saw King Crimson arose was due to his philosophy governing the band. Beat doesn't have that same philosophy. Although they're playing the tunes, they're playing them great, and they are paying homage to the music. The philosophy that holds the music together and gives it that King Crimson vibe is not there because there's nobody to enforce it. Adrian Blue's an amazing player. He's a huge contributor to that King Crimson, that era of King Crimson. But he doesn't have that same strict philosophy to guide the band in the same way that Robert Fripp did. So without that governing principle, Beat doesn't have the same feel, and those same transcendental experiences don't open up in the same way. Now, there's talk about Beat doing their own original music, and I think that's great. What I will tell you, though, is that music may or may not have as much to do with sounding like King Crimson because of that difference, because it's going to be headed up by those four guys. And that's great. That's how it should be. They should have their own identity, and I'm totally fine with it. They're not really saying they are King Crimson. No touch, no foul. So my advice to you is, of course, if you've not heard the album Beat, and especially Beat and those other three of the 80s trilogy, you should definitely go out and check all three of those albums out. They are profoundly inspirational to me. They're one of the reasons that I play stick today. But also, if you have the opportunity, go watch Beat play. You will not see a finer group of four musicians out there playing music that means a lot to them, that means a lot to people like me, who not only love the music for what it is, but love looking back at listening to the music with the ears of the person that I was back when I used to listen to it in college or in high school, and remembering what it felt like then, remembering all the time that's passed since then. It's a mix of nostalgia and aesthetic appreciation that I don't have many other opportunities to plot that on many other albums, and Beat is one of those albums. But that's all I got to say about it for now. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe, share it with your friends. Also, follow me over on Spotify. I'll put a King Crimson track up there on that list. You might as well check that out while you're over there. Also, I'm doing my top 20 to 2024 best of lists, and I have a viewers bracket if you want to be involved in that. Please sign up for my Patreon below, or if you just want to support the channel, I'd love to have your support. So until I see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.